May 12, 1943. Hamamleaf, Tunisia. The air hung heavy with diesel fumes and dust as the last German anti-aircraft crews abandoned their guns. The 8th Army had broken through to the coastal road. Allied tanks stood along the horizon, engines idling, their silhouettes framed by the morning haze. For the German soldiers of the Africa Corps, the end had come without ceremony. In small clusters they stepped forward, hands raised, helmets removed, faces streaked with grime and resignation. Among them, Gefreiter Georg Kellermann, a 41-year-old farmer from Bavaria, tried to read the faces of his captors. He had been told, like most of his comrades, that capture by the Americans meant humiliation or even death. Rumors had circulated for months, prisoners shot in ditches, starved, or forced into dangerous labor. Many believed surrender to the British was safer than to the Americans, whom German propaganda portrayed as crude and vengeful. As Kellermann dropped his rifle and lined up with hundreds of others, he braced for blows or barking orders. Instead, he was met with calm efficiency. Allied soldiers motioned them forward, handed out canteens of water and even cigarettes. The unexpected civility unsettled more than comforted. It was not the treatment of an inferior, but of a man processed through an organized system. At the first holding camp near Tunis, reality continued to diverge from expectation. Instead of punishment, there were medical inspections, delousing lines, and registration desks manned by English-speaking clerks. Each prisoner received a numbered tag, a thin blanket, and a ration tin. Meals were Spartan: beans, biscuits, and watery coffee, but they arrived on time. It was discipline without cruelty. Even so, apprehension persisted. "They are too quiet," one captured sergeant whispered. "They will kill us later." But the silence only meant efficiency. The Allied war machine did not waste motion, even on prisoners. When orders came for transfer, the men assumed they would be sent to British camps in Egypt or Kenya. The truth came as a shock. They were bound for the United States. For many, the idea was unthinkable, crossing the Atlantic, deep into enemy territory. Some feared torpedoes. Others assumed they were being sent for forced labor. When the convoy assembled at Oran, Kellermann watched from the deck of a converted Liberty ship as guards handed out life vests and issued warnings about submarine attacks. The voyage was long and rough. The men slept in stacked bunks, seasick and shivering. Depth charges exploded in the distance at night, and every vibration of the hull reminded them that they were now property of the Allied command. 19 days later, land appeared. Norfolk, Virginia, June 26, 1943. The pier was lined with military police, trucks, and interpreters. The men were marched through disinfectant tunnels, issued fresh uniforms marked PW, and served their first American meal. The sight of white bread, butter, and real meat left them speechless. "We thought it was a trick," one prisoner later wrote. "We waited for the punishment to follow." But none came. Instead, they were loaded onto trains with open windows. The guards relaxed, rifles slung over shoulders rather than pointed at men. The passing countryside, fields, silos, and neat towns gave a first glimpse of what wartime America looked like: calm, orderly, untouched by bombs. Their destination was Camp Huntsville, Texas. As the train slowed near the perimeter fence, the men expected barbed wire, dogs, and isolation. The barbed wire was there, but behind it were neat rows of barracks, wooden walkways, a canteen, and even a small theater. The commandant, an officer in starched khakis, greeted the first arrivals formally. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he announced. "If you obey the rules, you will be safe." For men conditioned to view the enemy as barbaric, the words carried no weight until they stepped inside and saw what awaited them. Inside the camp, the structure of daily life resembled that of a small town. The barracks were clean and raised on wooden stilts to prevent flooding. Each man had a cot, a pillow, and 2 sheets. The mess hall operated like a military cafeteria. Trays, line order, discipline. But the portions were generous. There was meat several times a week, vegetables daily, and on weekends, dessert. The taste of fresh milk and soft bread felt like an insult to the hardship they had endured in North Africa. Yet even the guards ate the same meals, which made the gesture seem genuine rather than mocking. Kellermann wrote in his diary, "I had thought the Americans would treat us as beasts. Instead, they treat us as men." Still, distrust lingered. The men waited for the moment the kindness would end, for the labor to turn brutal, the rations to be cut, the guards to show their true faces. They whispered at night that the Americans were trying to confuse them, to break their loyalty through comfort. Some believed it worked. Others refused to eat American food out of pride, surviving instead on Red Cross parcels and black bread baked secretly in camp kitchens. Even the guards were puzzled by the prisoners' discipline. They marched in formation to meals, saluted their German officers, and conducted roll call in precise order. But the Americans let them. The command understood that order prevented chaos. At dusk, the floodlights clicked on, but the camp stayed quiet. Radios played swing music from guard shacks, and the smell of cornfields drifted through the wire. To many prisoners, it felt less like captivity and more like a strange exile, safe, structured, and unnervingly humane. What none of them knew yet was that this civility had a purpose. The United States government saw its prisoner of war system not only as compliance with international law, but as an experiment in controlled rehabilitation. Over the next months, the prisoners would be sent to farms, introduced to American workers, and see firsthand how a democratic society functioned, even in wartime. For men who had been raised under authoritarian rule, the experience would unsettle old loyalties and plant new questions. But for now, as they settled into their bunks under the Texas heat, the thought that an enemy could show mercy was difficult to accept. When the trains finally screeched to a halt under the blazing Texas sun, the men braced for the worst. After all, they had seen what the war had done to Europe. Cities in ashes, prisoners starved in retribution. Many expected the same fate, only this time in the land of the enemy. But as the boxcar doors slid open, they were greeted not by bayonets, but by organized lines of American soldiers handing out canteens of cold water. Camp Huntsville, their destination, looked more like a small town than a prison. Neatly arranged wooden barracks stretched across rolling fields, whitewashed and numbered. A water tower gleamed in the distance, and even from the entrance the men could smell cooked food, real food. The first meal in America stunned them. Instead of watery soup or moldy bread, the trays were loaded with beans, cornbread, and coffee. The guards joked that the prisoners were eating better than some American civilians. For men who had spent weeks living on rations of hard biscuits and sand-filled water bottles, it felt almost unreal. The camp's rules followed the Geneva Convention precisely. No forced labor for combat-related work, no beatings, and equal treatment in food and housing to that of American troops. Each prisoner was issued 2 sets of uniforms, new boots, a cap, and a bunk with clean sheets. Daily life ran on a military schedule: revel at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work or study through the morning, recreation in the evening. The barracks were hot, the Texas humidity oppressive, but the men quickly realized they were safe. For the first time in months they could sleep without artillery in the distance. Still, suspicion lingered. Some believed this kindness was a trick, a way to soften them before interrogation. But the questioning was brief: name, rank, and number, nothing more. The Americans seemed uninterested in humiliation. Instead, they handed out cigarettes, organized soccer games, and even provided musical instruments. Within weeks, the prisoners were forming orchestras, holding church services, and starting language classes. The camp library carried both German and English books, from Goethe to Mark Twain. Kellerman, the Bavarian farmer captured in Tunisia, recorded in his diary, "The Americans feed us too well. They must have an endless supply. Even the guards joke with us. It is not what we were told." The daily routine became predictable. Work details were assigned across local farms, cotton fields, and lumber mills. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid a small wage, 80 cents a day, redeemable at the camp store. With it, they could buy soap, razors, writing paper, or even Coca-Cola. The first sip of the sweet drink startled most of them. Some laughed at the fizz, saying it tasted like liquid electricity. The guards were mostly young, polite, and often curious about their prisoners. Many were small-town Americans who had never met a German before. Some shared cigarettes or showed family photos. Others were wary, still bitter about Pearl Harbor or the death of a brother in Europe. But violence was rare. In fact, some guards treated the Germans with what could only be called professional respect. Letters from home were allowed, though heavily censored. It took months for replies to arrive from Germany, but those moments, when a name familiar from home appeared on the envelope, were priceless. The men would gather around, taking turns reading aloud or translating for others. For Kellerman, news of his wife Maria and son Otto in Bavaria was both comfort and pain. She writes that the crops are poor, he noted, but she says the church bells still ring. Religious life thrived. Every Sunday the camp chapel, once a mess hall, filled with both Protestants and Catholics. Hymns echoed through the compound, blending with the faint sound of baseball games from nearby fields. It was a strange harmony, faith, sport, and captivity existing side by side. Yet beneath the calm surface, tensions simmered. Within the camp, ideological divisions split the men. Hardcore National Socialists tried to enforce loyalty, threatening those who spoke against the Reich. Others, exhausted and disillusioned, wanted nothing to do with politics. These conflicts occasionally turned violent. At Camp Huntsville, one argument over a deck of cards erupted into a brawl that left a man dead. By late 1943, rumors spread of transfers west, to California or the Great Plains. The men speculated endlessly. Would they be sent to factories, to mines, or to other camps? They had learned that America's vastness made escape impossible. Even if one broke free, where could he run in a land that stretched farther than all of Europe? Still, amid the wire and discipline, something unexpected happened. The prisoners began to adapt. Some took pride in their farm labor, knowing their work helped feed the same civilians whose sons were fighting overseas. Others began to question what they had believed back home. One man remarked to a guard, "If this is how you treat your enemies, perhaps we were wrong about you." By Christmas of 1943, the camp was decorated with paper stars and makeshift trees. The Americans even issued extra rations: turkey, potatoes, cookies, and chocolate. For one night, the camp forgot the war outside. Songs in German and English mingled in the cold air, silent night drifting beyond the fences. For many, that evening marked the turning point. They realized captivity here was not punishment, but a pause, a strange peace in the middle of chaos. And yet, as word from Europe grew darker, they could not escape the feeling that the world they had left behind might never be the same. By the spring of 1945, the rhythm of life inside the American prisoner of war camps had become strangely predictable. Many of the German captives began to describe it as ein Leben im Stillstand, a life in pause. The days were structured with military precision, yet filled with unexpected liberties. They were still prisoners, fenced behind barbed wire, but what they were given within those limits challenged everything they had believed about their captors. In the mornings, the prisoners were counted. Every head tallied under the watch of armed sentries. Yet once the roll call ended, the rifles seemed to fade into the background. German craftsmen built furniture, painted murals, or repaired farm equipment for local use. The American guards often encouraged it, seeing the work as a way to keep morale steady. One former Luftwaffe mechanic later recalled, "We were not forced. We volunteered because it made us feel human again." Food remained one of the greatest shocks. The menu followed the U.S. Army's own supply system: white bread, potatoes, beans, butter, meat, and sometimes even coffee. For soldiers who had spent months living on thin rations during the Reich's collapse, this abundance felt surreal. Some camps even served German-style dishes once the prisoners began helping in the kitchen. In one camp in Texas, prisoners baked Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, Black Forest cake, for Christmas, using ingredients provided by American officers curious about the taste. The Red Cross inspections confirmed that American camps were among the best run in the world. Prisoners received mail from home, and censorship was often lenient. American officers allowed German-language newspapers to circulate, though stripped of propaganda. The papers carried war updates, cultural notes, and sometimes philosophical essays about rebuilding Europe. This intellectual freedom began changing minds quietly. Many of the younger soldiers, especially those drafted late in the war, began questioning the ideology that had driven them to fight. Work programs became a defining feature of their captivity. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could volunteer for non-military labor. Across the Midwest and South, German POWs picked cotton, harvested corn, built roads, and helped on farms. Farmers often treated them with civility. Some even offered cold lemonade or shared a cigarette during breaks. Letters later revealed how some Germans were shocked by these small acts of kindness. One wrote, "They see us not as Nazis, but as men." Recreation flourished too. In some camps, orchestras formed from salvaged instruments. Others hosted soccer matches, stage plays, or art exhibitions. There were even classrooms. American officers invited volunteer teachers among the prisoners to hold lessons in mathematics, literature, and engineering. For many, these schools behind wire became their first contact with democratic ideas, free discussion, and critical thought, things forbidden back home under the Reich. By the time the war ended, many of these men had spent years living within the contradiction of captivity that offered more humanity than the system they once served. When repatriation began in late 1945, some refused to leave immediately. They feared what awaited them in the ruins of post-war Germany. Others left with deep gratitude, sending letters back to their American hosts years later. One former prisoner, who had spent 3 years in a camp in Georgia, wrote decades afterward, "America showed me what freedom looked like, even from behind barbed wire." The experience of the German prisoners of war in the United States became one of the quietest, least-known stories of the Second World War, an episode where compassion, not vengeance, shaped the victor's conduct. In a world torn by brutality, it stood as proof that mercy could still exist amid total war.